It's important that we all get involved, as Mike said. More involved than we are. I know we're involved, but between now and next year, I think we all have to get involved more. And Gary is involved. Gary was in Harrisburg when was it, Thursday, Gary?
Thursday. Yeah, last Thursday.
Last Thursday.
She and I were both there.
At a hearing.
5 copies, there's enough for the site. We would just pass those back.
By an education committee in the U.S. Or the Pennsylvania Senate, and testified on behalf of his position on Common Core. So he can certainly give us detailed information as to what happened in that meeting and a full perspective of what's going on top to bottom with the Common Core implementation here in the state of Pennsylvania. And then we're going to open it up to questions. So, Gary, thank you.
What I'd like to do tonight is, and I've got handouts, but I think there's enough copies for everybody, is I know, and we're going to talk about where we are today. I think it's important that we all understand how we got here. So we're going to have to go back to 2001. There's something called No Child Left Behind. Okay, this was an initiative that was passed in Congress with the support of Ted Kennedy and President Bush, and it was all about improving academic performance. The key element of that was that every child in school was supposed to be 100% proficient in some of the key course materials, such as literature and mathematics, by the year 2014. So this is 2001. In 2006, I call it panic, and it was panic within Pennsylvania. 40% of the graduates were not proficient in any of the stuff that they were supposed to be 100% proficient on. There were 62,000 graduates just in the community colleges that were in remediation. Okay, so they were graduating from high school, they couldn't read, well, I shouldn't say they couldn't read, but they couldn't handle math, they couldn't even handle community college stuff. So the state was spending something to the tune of $26 or $27 million a year just remediating. So this is 2006, panic. So over the next couple of years, what all the educators were doing in Pennsylvania is they were basically rewriting all of the academic standards within the state of Pennsylvania. And that was going on for a couple of years. And then we had an election in 2008, and we got a new president and a new Secretary of Education, a guy named Arnie Duncan out of Chicago. And shortly after the first of the year in 2009, there was a whole bunch of stuff going on. Stimulus money flying all over the place and whatever. There was an education piece of that called Race to the Top. And this was an opportunity for every state to have access to like oodles and oodles and oodles of money. And our governor, Ed Rendell at the time, on June 26 of 2009, signed a piece of paper that committed, the operative word is committed Pennsylvania to implement a new higher level set of curriculum standards and national assessments to determine whether or not the children were achieving what the curriculum standards were. Now, at that point in time, nothing was called Common Core, nothing was called anything, but that's what it was. And believe me, when he signed that piece of paper, he committed Pennsylvania. So we need to all understand that. So then everything was going on for a while. Shortly after the turn of the year in 2010, the standards of what were to become the Common Core standards were released. They got dropped into Pennsylvania. In the meantime, Pennsylvania was already in this panic mode, redoing their academic standards. They retained the University of Pittsburgh and said, hey, let's compare these things. The PA standards that we just did, these new Common Core standards, and the University of Pittsburgh did the alignment study. They completed that study in June of 2010. I've read the highlights of it, and the study basically says that for all intent and purposes, the Common Core standards that came out of Washington were pretty much aligned with what the educators in Pennsylvania had already done. So they felt like it was sort of okay. I shouldn't say sort of, they felt it was all right, okay? It was aligned with work that had been done in Pennsylvania. In June of 2010, they completed that study. On the 2nd of July of 2010, after going through the normal process, the Common Core standards, academic standards, and graduation requirements were adopted as a regulation for Pennsylvania. It was adopted, and it was the law, a regulation, and it happened on July 2nd of 2010, over 3 years ago. And what was adopted as a regulation then was the Common Core standards. There were going to be 10 keystone tests that over time are going to be implemented. The tests were going to be end-of-course exams that were going to count for 1/3 of the student's grade. There was going to be an extensive gathering of data from the student as well as parents, societal data from the family and what have you. So all of this stuff was enacted back in 2010, and it became law. It went through all the process. It was approved by the State Board of Education. It was approved by the House Education Committee. It was approved by the Senate Education Committee. And the group that I attended last week approved it. The Regulatory Review Commission approved this stuff back in 2010. Over the next couple of years, what was going on was they had to actually put pen to paper, document all this stuff. You can imagine the bureaucratic process was going on. They had to create some of these keystone exams and what have you. And around the middle of 2012, they announced the schedule for these keystone exams, which actually started being given. There were some trial tests earlier. Now this is important. I was sitting in a school board meeting one night, around that time, maybe in May or June or something, and the school board voted to buy a bunch of new textbooks. And they said they were compliant with Common Core. I didn't know what the hell Common Core was. Now, this is in like May or June of 2012. This thing had been approved already for 2 years. I never even heard of it. And I would contend that 99.9% of the people in Pennsylvania have heard of it. Okay? It had already been done, it had been signed, it had been sealed, it had been delivered, and school districts were already beginning to buy textbooks, you know, to implement the curriculum, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of where we are in 2012. In March of 2013, just earlier this year, the State Board of Education made a few more changes in what had been previously approved. I think they made some name changes and a few other things. And when the State Board of Education approves some of these things, it's all part of something called Regulation 22, Chapter 4, which is the school code that governs academic standards and graduation requirements. And they had to send that, after they approved it, they send it to the State or the Senate Education Committee, the House Education Committee, for their review. None of this stuff gets reviewed and voted on by the legislature, by the way. This is done in the committees. So they sent this stuff down to the Senate and House Education Committees. Well, along around now, people are starting to find out about this Common Core stuff. So the House and Senate Education Committees in the earlier part of this year, leading up into the spring, start having hearings. Well, there's people coming in on busloads, beating them up over the head, yelling and screaming and hollering, what's this Common Core stuff all about? We don't like it, it's terrible. You know, some of the types of things that Mike talked about, we think it's obtrusive, we think it's totally unfair that it's 1/3 of a student's grade, because if they are bad test takers, it's going to impact their GPA average, it's going to screw up where they are in the rankings at the end of the school year, and graduation. We don't like it. So what happened then is the education committees went back and sent a whole bunch of stuff back to the State Board of Education with a bunch of recommendations. Now, in the middle of all of this, in August of this year, the state got a waiver from that No Child Left Behind thing that took place. And one of the elements of No Child Left Behind was that every year, every school had to do something called annual yearly progress. We've maybe heard of it as AYP. So Pennsylvania got a waiver from that AYP thing, and there was a substitution put into place, and I'll mention that in a minute. So all these changes that were recommended as a result of these hearings went back up to the State Board of Education. And on September 12th of this year, the State Board of Education voted on what I'm going to call version 2, okay, of the academic standards and graduation requirements. And the vote was 13-4. The 4 people that voted against it are important, and I'll talk about them in a minute. Now, what did they do when they voted this time compared to what they did, 3 years earlier in 2010? They took the number of Keystone exams, which were 10, they knocked them down to 5. They changed them from being a end-of-course grade determiner to a graduation requirement. So starting for kids that graduated in 2017, they have to be proficient in Algebra 1, Literature, and Biology to graduate. Now there's some other things about graduation, I'll cover those in a minute. So the student has to pass, be proficient in each one of those 3, along with some other things to graduate. The other thing that they did, and I'll talk about that also, is they eliminated totally the gathering of any family data. Remember the family data thing I talked about? They eliminated the need for that. In the regulations that they published, it clearly states that there will be no statewide mandated curriculum. There'll be no statewide mandated reading list. I mean, all of this stuff is in black and white, okay? It's on the sheet that they have sent out back to everybody that says we pulled a lot of these things out of there, okay? So what we're left with at this point in time is we've still got what is now called Pennsylvania Core Standards, which are, for all intent and purposes, they're pretty much the same as the original Common Core Standards that came out of Washington. Because remember I said the University of Pittsburgh did this alignment study, and they said, yeah, they're pretty much the same, okay? And the difference is that, that when they get into a subject, whether it be literature or mathematics, they spend more time narrowly in a subject, but they go deeper. So as opposed to maybe covering the waterfront and maybe getting this deep into a subject, they cover this much, but they go this deep, all right? And for those of you that are educators, I guess you can understand that, and I guess it makes some sense. I don't know, but that's what they're going to do. So what we've got now is we've got fewer Keystone exams than we had before. There are graduation requirements. Supposedly there's no statewide curriculum, there's no statewide reading list, there's no gathering of family data, and there's no increase in any student data gathering as a result of the implementation of Common Core. And you can see those words if you want to read what the final regulation looks like. That's what it says, and I think a lot of that was done to try to appease some of the people that made the appeals. I mentioned the lack of AYP. There was something that was replaced with that, and it's called the School Performance Profiles. Those were published starting around a little after October 1st. They're available online. I wrote the website down there. It's paschoolperformance.org. You can go on that website, you can punch up your county, you can punch up your school district, and you can see what your school did. It's every single school individually. And it tells you what the ethnicity breakdown is of the school, profile on the number of students, profile on the grades, profile on economic disadvantage. It'll give you the latest round of Keystone test scores, if they're available, or if Keystone test scores for the high school level and the PSSA test for the lower level. And you ought to take a look at that, and it gives you an academic performance number, okay, for the school. Now, those performance profiles are important because one of the things that they're going to be used for not only is to assess how well the school is doing, but it's also, my understanding, that those school performance profiles are an element, okay, of a teacher evaluation system, which is in the process of being placed, that will have impact on the evaluation for the teacher and the principal in the school. Now, I don't know what the details specifically are on that. I understand that the Pennsylvania State Education Association is not real happy with that. They're probably trying to fight it, but it's my understanding that these performance profiles at the school level will have an impact potentially at some point in time on teacher performance and principal performance. So that's pretty much, that's pretty much where we are. So the State Board of Education approved this thing on September 12th. They sent it down to the state, or the Senate and House Education Committees. Those committees said okay. Don't know when they did it. Then they sent it to the final group that looks at this stuff, which is a group called the Independent Regulatory Review Commission. And this is the group that approved this thing originally, way back in 2010. So now they're back again, 3 years later. And Judy and I went to the hearing, the reason that I went to the hearing was, first of all, I found out about it from a Senator Denneman who's down in the Chester County area. And the reason that I found out about it was that the day after the State Board of Education approved all of the final regulations, I whipped off a letter to the respective heads of the Senate and House Education Committees, Tom Corbett, Rosemary Brown, Lisa Baker, and every other friggin' person I can think of. Okay? And Denneman, and I had my email address in there, so Denneman sends me an email that says, hey, we got this hearing coming up in whatever. So I got in touch with him. I said, I want to be a speaker. There were like 300 people that had submitted comments, I went up there and I made my piece, and I want to sort of describe to you what happened that day, okay? Because I think it's important. The hearing started at 10 o'clock in the morning. The vote was taken about 3:45 in the afternoon, and there were 2 5-minute breaks. Went straight through. The hearing opened with a 1 hour and 15-minute presentation with all sorts of overheads and charts and graphs by Senator Denneman. And then there were presentations by the State Board of Education, presentations by the Pennsylvania Department of Education, and then roughly 40 of us, people from all over, different walks of life, people that were education advocates, people that were school board members, and what have you, made their piece. And what I was there objecting to was the unfunded cost of the entire effort, and specifically the inappropriateness of having these high-stake graduation exams, which I think are totally inappropriate. And the reason that the State Board of Education, etc., wants to have these high-stakes exams is they believe that there needs to be some accountability and a hook for the student for some, that they need to really try hard to pass these tests. And one of the issues, of course, is that if you got somebody in the 8th grade taking an Algebra 1 class, they're going to get that test at the end of the course. And I challenge anybody to think that most 8th graders have a real concept of what the significance of and what the consequences are and what's going to happen maybe 5 years down the road. But anyway, so that's really what happened that day. And I'm going to come back to a few more things about what the implications are. The Denneman, was one of the 4 no votes in September, okay, along with 3 other members of the State Board of Education. The other 3 members of the State Board of Education are the respective majority and minority. Think of that as the Republican and the Democratic heads of the respective Senate and House Education Committees. So the people that were elected all voted no. The appointed people all voted yes for the State Board of Education. The people that voted 3-2 last Thursday were all appointed by different people. I mean, some were reported by Republicans, some were reported by Democrats. I couldn't figure out, based on who appointed them, whether there was any political party affiliation in how they voted. But the people that voted against it, the 2 people, voted against it because of the funding issues. The people that voted for it primarily because they were sincerely of the belief that if this was not approved, we would go back to what was approved in 2010, which had 10 Keystone exams, which had data mining for kids and parents, and it would be a step backward, okay? So they were voting for it basically from the standpoint of we need to keep going forward. Now, I think it's important for all of us to realize that at no time did I hear from any of the people that were making the decisions that none of them had an issue with the Common Core standards. Not one issue at all with the standards. They were interested and had an issue with the implementation costs, the impact on local school districts, and what it was going to mean to taxpayers, and what it was going to mean to certain people. For example, some of the people I have mentioned at the bottom, there's a Senator Fulmer who wasn't there, and he's the Republican head of the Senate Education Committee. Now, he's a senator down in the Lancaster area, and Dinniman referenced the issues that some of these people have as to how they're dealing with their constituencies and what have you. And he cited this high school that's down there. It's a 2,000 student high school. It's called Conestoga Valley High School. They have 100% graduation. They have 47 National Merit Scholars. Their last round of testing at the high school level in the 11th grade was 95%. All right? So they're sitting there saying, leave me alone. What do you want? You want me to do this nonsense? I don't need any help. Okay? We know exactly what we're doing. We have the right kind of curriculum. We don't need any Common Core, ISMO, Gizmo from anybody else. There's another name on the bottom there, and he's the minority chair of the House Education Committee, Democratic Senator, Democratic Representative. His name is Robach, and he's out of Philadelphia. And he's at the other end of the spectrum. They're about bankrupt. They had to close all the libraries. They got 45, 50 kids in each class now. All right? And he's sitting there saying, you want me to do this? I'm worried about keeping the heat going in the building. Okay? And you want me to implement some new harebrained scheme out of somewhere? I don't care whether it came from Washington or Harrisburg. You want me to deal with that? So what you've got there, okay, is the inherent fallacy of Common Core. One size does not fit all. The people in Conestoga that have got 47 National Merit Scholars need this as much as I need a hole in the head. And the people in Philadelphia, they need a hell of a lot more than this, okay? They need a whole bunch of money, maybe a reorganization or something like that. But yet, they're being asked to do the same thing that Pocono Mountain High Schools have being done, people in Altoona, people in Pittsburgh, and what have you. But it's important for us, I think, to remember, okay, that as we implement this stuff, all right, because each of us are going to be involved, for those of us that are involved in the school board. The East Stroudsburg School District is going to have to change all the graduation requirements, okay, as soon as this becomes official. And it doesn't get official until, I guess, the Attorney General has to take a look at it to make sure there's some legal issues, and it gets published in something called the Pennsylvania Bulletin, and then each school district has 6 months to basically circulate all this stuff to parents and students and what have you. So all the graduation requirements are going to have to change. The schools are already starting to buy textbooks, okay, that are supposedly aligned with Common Core, even though I think maybe some teachers probably don't even think they need them. But the fact of the matter is that we're in it and what have you. Now, it's important, I think, from what I observed and what I heard. I talked to Dinniman. I pulled him aside after the whole thing was over. And I said, what are you going to do now? And he's going to do some things, all right? He's going to pass some legislation, or try to anyways, excuse me. But it's all around the edges. He thinks he can pass some legislation to make sure that, that there's no more than 3 Keystone exams going forward. There's supposed to be 5, and he thinks he can get rid of that. In the current regulation, there is a opt-out for political reasons if a parent can demonstrate that the assessment system, the Keystone assessment, violates their religious beliefs, and they can get out of the Keystone thing, but then of course they're going to have to take something called a project, which is still aligned with the curriculum requirements and what have you. And he told me he was thinking about maybe an expanded parental opt-out thing, okay? What he's not thinking about doing is killing this thing. There is nobody that I have either talked to or read about or what have you in Harrisburg that is on a horse to put a stake in the heart of Common Core. I'm just telling you, that's a fact. Everybody up there, Dinniman, Fulmer, Clymer, down in Bucks County, every single one of these people are in favor, okay, of higher standards. I don't think they've got any issues with the essence of Common Core curriculum or anything. If they do, I certainly don't sense it, I didn't see it, and I didn't hear it. Now, there were a lot of people making comments that day, okay, about certain specific elements that they have seen or their child has seen. And I'm telling you, it had no impact. Absolutely none. The only impact that these guys were looking at was really the financial impact and what it's going to do to them. And a lot of this is very political. And I'll give you an example. Dinniman, who spent an hour and a half, okay, Democratic senator from down in the Chester County area, very vocal, very much opposed to the unfunded burden and the impact of the Keystone exams on graduation, what have you. He's got a resolution supporting his position by every single Democratic senator in Harrisburg, all 23 of them, including Pocono and everybody else. And what he's really upset about is that he can't get out of the Pennsylvania Department of Education a definitive estimate of what it's going to cost to implement this thing. And he made that point numerous times that day. In fact, he couldn't even get the Keystone test results out of the Pennsylvania Department of Education. He had to go through a right to know request. He's a friggin' senator. Okay?
Wow.
Now, the question that he was asking, and the question that the people were still answering, even last Thursday, was that this new version of all of this stuff that was voted on in September is not going to cost any more than what was approved back in 2010. Their contention is, well, there's less keystones, there's less this, there's less this, there's less that. But Mike mentioned the number, I've heard the number, or no, Greer mentioned the number, anywhere from $300 to $700 million. Now, the reason that Dinniman is pushing so hard in this thing, and oh, by the way, he had some very, very unkind words to say about the Pennsylvania Department of Education. These people are not ready for prime time. And he says that right there in public, okay? And they're all sitting there. The Pennsylvania Department of Education has gone through 3 directors in the last 3 years, okay? And they're the bad people here because they won't tell us as legislators what this thing is going to cost, so that when we have to deal with the funding mechanism next year, we won't know how much money to set aside. Now, whether or not they're going to have enough money to set aside or not, remember, next year is an election year.
Yes.
And what he was setting up really was what has already been starting, and that is that Corbett is going to get the living crap beat out of him over unfunding of lower funding than what's needed for public education. So this is just an example to allow them to, to use that from a political standpoint. So the message there, I think, for all of us, at least the message that I came back with was, oh, and then there's somebody by the name of Tallman, it's a Representative Tallman. He introduced 5 different pieces of legislation in July. House Bill 1551, I mentioned them down below, through 1555. 3 of those pieces of legislation have basically already been eliminated from a need standpoint based upon changes in this stuff that was approved in September. But there's still one other piece in there, and basically was that you can't implement any of this without legislative approval, all right? Which is sort of a step in the direction of putting the legislature in front of all of this thing. Unfortunately, the guy only had 20 co-sponsors. He doesn't have anybody with any real muscle. It was introduced on July 28th. It's been sitting there for 4 months. I've talked to the guy. He doesn't even think it's ever going to get out of committee, okay? So, if there's a sense to put a stake in the heart of Common Core, this is going to be one tough struggle. I did not get the sense from anybody in Harrisburg that that's the page they're on. Okay? They all got a lot of issues with it. They got issues with the unfunded mandate part. They got issues with the exams as being too high stake. They got some issues, but I didn't get the sense that anybody's got an issue with the fundamental essence of Common Core and the curriculum. So if that's what there's a sense that needs to be done, I've only got one suggestion. And my suggestion is that if every executive group of every Tea Party in Pennsylvania feels the same way, they're gonna have to do it in minutes. It can't be done on an individual county basis. It's gonna have to be done in minutes. And so my suggestion is, reach out and get in touch with every other Tea Party group that you can think of, find out what their position is, and see if you can build some sort of a coalition to try to begin to start approaching legislators to see if you can build up some sort of a consensus to get some sentiment in Harrisburg to stop this thing. The only way it can be stopped is a legislative action on the part of the House and the Senate. But I got to tell you, I'm not sensing that anybody up there is on that page right now. Thank you very much.